I've been involved in education for over 30 years, 17 of those exclusively as a student. But don't discount that experience, because that's when I learned the most about teaching. I can assure you, my 10th grade algebra teacher taught me everything I needed to know about ineffective instruction. After 4 years in a classroom, I was sick of how education was panning out, so I transitioned into leadership, which is how I've spent the last 7 years. I firmly believe that organizational initiatives largely succeed or fail based on a leader's ability to build relationships. I've seen leaders demolish entire organizations within 6 months because they can't form relationships. And this isn't something that only happens in education. Just look at Steve Jobs. He was fired from the company he founded because his overinflated ego made it impossible for him to build and sustain relationships. Simon Sinek once said, "Leaders are so busy trying to be in charge that they forget to take care of those in their charge." And I think this is because leaders are so busy trying to prove themselves, they've forgotten what's actually important: authenticity. And when conducting research on the importance of authenticity in leadership, one thing consistently emerged. John Wayne is the reason for all of our problems. Now, if you really love John Wayne, don't dismiss me just yet. I gave this talk at a prison 2 weeks ago, and one of their very first questions was, "So why do you hate John Wayne so much?" I don't hate the Duke, people. I'm sure he was a lovely man who did a lot for God and country, and it's not him as much as it's his persona that's done so much damage. We're working with a generation of leaders who grew up with John Wayne in their homes. We heard his characters say things like, "I'm only responsible for what I say, not what you understand. And if everything isn't black and white, I say, why the hell not?" And my personal favorite, "Don't apologize, mister. It's a sign of weakness." While researching for this presentation, I even heard this little joke. Did you know John Wayne had a failed toilet paper line? It was rough, tough, and didn't take crap from anyone. So there's that. And the fact that this joke exists is proof that this is how people perceived him. And if we perceived him to be this way, and we simultaneously idolized him, it's understandable that as we laid on the floor and we stared at the TV, we began to form these concepts of what it meant to be respected, what it meant to be strong, what it meant to have people follow you. And so it makes sense that as we grew up and we went into leadership positions, it was this mentality we went back to when we formulated our leadership styles. Today's leaders grew up with John Wayne being their idol, or their parents or friends. A recent poll shows that John Wayne is ranked as the 7th favorite actor in America today, even though he died in 1979. And this staying power means that even leaders who were born in the 80s are likely to adhere to this John Wayne style of management, either because they grew up watching him, or they're modeling the leadership styles of their early bosses. And this, my friends, is where it all falls apart. Now, don't get me wrong. I love all-American infallibility as much as the next guy, or girl, or gender nonconformist, but not in leadership. In John Wayne's heyday, leadership is portrayed as male-dominated, ego-driven, and power-hungry. These leaders are strong, silent, stoic, and they shoot first, and they ask questions later. And if you're about to die on a battlefield, that might work, right? But we're not. Leaders who are desperate to build strong organizations have latched onto these concepts, and they've elevated them to a level that is damaging. Today's leaders often operate from a place of fear, habit, and a desire for power. We err on the side of being assertive, aggressive, and political with overinflated egos. We tend not to care how people perceive us. We believe there are no gray areas. We're above doing work we believe to be below us, and we're not going to apologize for it. As a result, we make decisions that prohibit connections and relationships from being formed. This is the John Wayne mindset, and it's killing our organizations. Current research in organizational psychology tells us that integrity is the most desired trait in leaders. But according to a recent survey by the American Psychological Association, over 35% of employees don't trust their company leadership. Another recent study of over 9,000 employees in more than 20 industries showed that 70% of employees can't picture themselves at their current companies next year. While marinating on this topic, I began to think that part of the reason for this is that we thought John Wayne was a fantastic leader. We thought he had integrity. He stood by his word. He said he was going to do something, and then he did it. But I think we've oversimplified here, because that's not actually integrity. That's just follow-through. Because the truth is that in order to have integrity, we have to be authentic. And in order to be authentic, we have to be willing to put our ego aside and be vulnerable. Now, most leaders wouldn't put vulnerability in their top 10 list of desirable characteristics, but it's vulnerability that allows us to put our ego aside and build trust. Leaders are largely going John Wayne on us because they're unwilling to be vulnerable. This would require the bravery to admit mistakes, taking into account the perceptions of others, and examining the intricacies of meaningful communication. And this is a major problem because when our leaders are unwilling to be vulnerable, we don't trust them. And when we don't trust them, relationships are unable to form. Because as Brené Brown's research shows us, vulnerability is critical to building relationships. And when we look at the idolized cowboy that we've modeled ourselves after, I'm pretty sure vulnerability isn't a word we're using to describe him. A stronger cowboy to follow might be Robert Greenleaf. Okay, I know at first glance he doesn't exactly scream cowboy, but that's because he's actually a pioneer. Greenleaf pioneered the servant leadership theory and argued that employees will freely respond only to individuals who are chosen as leaders because they are proven and trusted as servants. Greenleaf also lays out patterns of effective leadership through a servant lens. These items include sustaining spirit over ego, acceptance and healing over judgment, and systematic neglect over perfectionism. Systematic neglect basically means prioritizing what's most important and allowing some things to fall by the wayside when needed. And too often, I believe, leaders feel like relationships are one of those things that can be systematically neglected. This is incredibly inaccurate. People need authentic relationships with their leaders all the time. People trust and get behind leaders who are human and vulnerable. It was ultimately Greenleaf's work that stopped me from becoming John Wayne. When I first went into administration, I had 2 master's degrees. I was coming off the heels of a school and district teacher of the year award. I had published work with numerous agencies, including Pearson, and I literally wrote the state standards for theater. But none of that seemed to matter because I was 30 and I looked 23 and I was a woman. Well, I'm still a woman, but now I don't apologize for it. And I can assure you that ageism and sexism run rampant. And I was determined to fight my way through all that junk with the John Wayne mentality. I was gonna go in there, and I was gonna be the bravest, strongest, most fearless administrator anyone had ever seen. And then I realized that being an administrator of an elementary school really means you do cafeteria duty all day long. And it is really hard to walk around a cafeteria in heels like a cowboy. I actually looked more like a newborn giraffe. This is not what I was supposed to be doing. How was I going to prove myself as a young female leader, and what were people going to think of me when I was cutting yogurt pouch tops and cleaning up spilled milk instead of doing meaningful work that made me seem important? But then I had an encounter with a sobbing 5-year-old boy on the first day of school that changed my perspective. Apparently, The bread from his sandwich had shifted in his lunchbox, rendering it broken. And as I stared into his terrified little face, I realized that, like his 71 peers, he'd never eaten alone before. I set aside my ego and my desire for power, and I took a moment to see that he was scared and hungry and helpless. I sought to understand with empathy. And when I fixed the sandwich and I handed it back to him, this little boy threw his arms around my waist and he said, "Thanks. Do you want a bite?" You leave it to children to show you what really matters. Something I did made a difference. I began to build a relationship with him. Had I kept my mindset of needing to do more important things, I would have missed the most important point. Because I built a connection with him, research shows that his academic performance will improve and he'll be more likely to build relationships within the school. Transforming leadership takes work. It demands vulnerability, caring, and authenticity. And these items need to be a priority regardless of what is going on in the organization. Leaders want their organizations to be successful, but they're clinging on to ideals that they believe make them seem brave, strong, and powerful. And they believe this is what makes people respect them. They're preserving their own egos instead of building trust. But when our leaders do take steps to build trust, employees feel more connected to their organizations, which results in improved outcomes. This John Wayne mindset has gotten us into trouble. It's time to transform what strong leadership means by being pioneers of authentic relationships instead of being the cowboys who shoot first and ask questions later. It's about transforming our thinking. We need to remove our egos and see others' needs as paramount. If you're not a leader, be the person you wish your leader could be. If you are a leader, this means having genuine integrity. It means prioritizing authentic relationships and being vulnerable. Thank you.